Good evening, friends, and everyone who is interested and engaged in caring for orphans around the world. Welcome to Mission Now, a virtual event that acknowledges and honors the impact Christians make serving orphans around the world. Tonight, we will explore ways in which we can engage in mission now, despite the pandemic, travel restrictions, and physical barriers and limitations. Many of you have emailed me, text messaged me, called me, and asked this one question. Do you have mission trips scheduled for this year? Well, that was last year, same thing this year, and I still don't have an answer for you. It is sad, it is disheartening. However, I believe there are many things we can still do today, do now, to be on mission now. My name is Connie Belciug. I'm the Executive Director for Children's Emergency Relief International, or CERI. It is a true honor for us to host this event. I know many of you are familiar to me, and I know that many of you are new. It is a privilege to have both familiar faces and new people on the call. Please know you are welcome, and we are grateful for your participation. Throughout the program, please use the Q&A feature for asking questions. And please be aware that this event is being recorded to be made available later on for many of the people who emailed us and said they cannot be on tonight. I trust this event will be both enlightening and engaging, and partially because of our wonderful host and moderator for this evening. He's my colleague and a passionate advocate for children. His name is Ian Forber-Pratt. He was born in Kolkata, India. Ian was adopted and raised in the United States. He's a trained social worker and skilled at translating policies into practices and at advocating for better care and better laws for children and families. Ian is CERI's Director of Global Advocacy and will lead tonight's discussion through the lens of his own life and professional experience. Ian, the microphone is yours.
All right. Thank you, Connie, and thank you, everyone. On behalf of the CERI family, we're so grateful to the panelists for being here. Just wanted to give a quick layout of what things will look like tonight. I'm going to give some quick introductions of the panelists and then ask Jedd to lead us in a devotional and a little bit of prayer, and then start a panel discussion where I'll ask each panelist a question that we've individualized for them, and then open it up to discussion. So I encourage everybody here to send questions into the chat. If you have any comments, reflections on anything anybody said, we hope that this is interactive. So panelists, I have put together these bios, and so please correct me or share anything else. But I'd like to start and thank Dr. Hillis for being here, who is an adoptive mother of 11 and a guest researcher at the Centers for Disease Control. 8 of those children are adopted from Russia. And Dr. Hillis has worked and administered in countries in South America and Africa and Eastern Europe, and is a leading expert on public health risks among vulnerable kids around the world. And we'll be asking you some questions about that today. And then Elli Oswald, so grateful for you to be here. She's the Executive Director of Faith to Action Initiative, which works and seeks to educate and mobilize churches and faith-based organizations and individuals on evidence-based practices and care for orphan and vulnerable children. And we were talking about this before we started. Prior to this role, she was a missions pastor at a church in Seattle. And so we're really grateful to have you here. Damaris Fike, who is the social action pastor at City Church. We're grateful to have you here as well. And what we know of you is that you lead a team that serves vulnerable people in San Antonio and around the world, and that you have a background in design and communication. And whether it's fighting hunger or creating access to life-saving vaccinations, your goal is to inspire individuals to be part of the local and global force for good. And we've been able to interact with you working with an organization in Mexico, and we'll ask you some great questions about that. And then Jedd Medefind, we're so grateful you're here. Jedd's the president of the Christian Alliance for Families and Orphans. And what we know of you, Jedd, is that you believe that love for orphans transforms. You've served at the White House as a special assistant to President George W. Bush, leading the Office of Faith-Based and Community Initiatives. And you and your wife, Rachel, have welcomed kids through birth, foster care, and adoption. So that's what I know. So grateful to have you all here. And Jedd, I'd love to ask you if you lead us in a devotional and a word of prayer. You are muted.
There we go. You'd think we'd figure this out after a year and a half of Zoom. Hey, well, it's a joy to be with y'all. And, with Christmas just ahead, I would love for us to ponder one question together. And that is this: what is the most precious gift that we have to give to family and friends and coworkers, those we serve through ministries like CERI? What is the most precious gift we have to offer? Is it clean water or food or medicine or shelter, education? And I would propose tonight that all of these things matter. Some of them matter immensely. Some of them are matters of life and death. But when we think deep and when we listen to the cries of our heart, our own heart, the hearts of those we love and serve, we know that there is always something deeper. What every vulnerable child needs, and what every struggling adult needs, and what every single one of us on this gathering need, is simply this: to be loved and to know that we are. That is the deepest need every one of us has. And that is the most precious gift that we have to give to others, that they would be truly loved and that they would know that they are. So, of course, that asks the question, how do we do that? And certainly there are so many ways, right? We can do that in words. And if we're not doing it in words, we need to start. We need to express our love to those nearest us, to those we encounter. We need to tell them of our love and that their Heavenly Father loves them more than they can know. We do need to put it into words. And of course, we can also do this with tangible things, meeting physical needs. I know this is the first thing that CERI does. When there's a physical or tangible need, they seek to meet that need in a very, very physical way. And these things matter immensely as well, the tangible ways in which we provide love and physical things to others. But I would argue that there is a third and final thing that we can provide that is more precious than either words or physical objects, and that is simply the gift of presence. The gift of presence. And I think we see this particularly vividly in Scripture, in a story that maybe you've heard before from the Gospels. Jesus was on the far side of the Sea of Galilee, and he's with his disciples, and they land on the shore, and he gets out and he wades up onto the bank. And of course, there's this huge crowd there. They've been waiting for him, and there's urgency and noise, and people are elbowing one another. Everyone wants to get a piece of him. And then through the crowd, a father of a girl who's dying, he presses forward and he says, "Jesus, will you come with me? My daughter is dying." And so, of course, Jesus says yes. And they set off across the hillside, this huge crowd. You could just imagine it flowing like an avalanche. And in the middle of all of that, the noise and the urgency, Jesus stops. And he says, "Who touched me?" And of course, people around him say, "Jesus, everyone's touching you." But he says, "No, I know that someone touched me because power went out from me." And the gospel goes on to explain that there had been a woman with a bleeding disease, that she'd been bleeding for 12 years, and the doctors had taken her money and left her none the better for it all. And in desperation, she had reached out of the crowd to touch Jesus for physical healing. And remarkably, the gospels tell us that in the moment that she touched him, she received the physical healing that she had thought she came for. But for Jesus, that wasn't enough. And he waited in that moment amidst all the urgency that was pulling him off to some far off crisis. But he waited in that moment until this woman came out of the crowd. And you can just see him there giving his full attention, his eyes and his ears and his heart to this one woman that almost certainly had been pushed to the edge of society all her life. And one of the gospel accounts describes that she told him the whole story, all of the details of how the doctors had taken her money and she'd suffered and been on the edge of the society. And then only at the end of all that did Jesus say, daughter, go in peace. Your faith has made you well. And I find it particularly remarkable that in the midst of all of those demands and all of that sense of urgency, Jesus gave himself fully to this one woman, even after she had received the physical healing that she thought she came for. Because I believe Jesus knew that what she needed even more than that was the full attention that he gave her, the listening ears, the kind eyes, the tender heart. That is the gift of presence. And when God's people, when any of us express that gift to someone in front of us, whether it's our kids, our spouse, our coworkers, people we're serving, we are reflecting the presence of our Lord. You know, no one has done that more for me, more vividly in my lifetime, actually, than my father. His name was Jedd Medefind. The students called him Mr. Med. He was a high school biology teacher for 40 years in the town where I grew up. And even now, when I'll be going back there in a few weeks for Christmas, if I go to a supermarket or if I'm, even if I get a ticket from a policeman or something, no matter who it is, it almost always seems like if they see my last name, they'll say, wait, are you Mr. Med's son? And I'll say, yes, I am. And they will almost inevitably go on to say, oh, he was my favorite teacher. And of course, when they go on they always will go on and recount a few details or stories about something that they particularly appreciated. And I can't remember a single time when what they said was, he taught me so much about biology, or his tests were great, or he actually was a great biology teacher. I took his classes 2 different times and I learned a ton. But what was so compelling about Mr. Med was his presence. And truthfully, even though it was a public high school, it was a presence that in every way reflected the presence of Jesus Christ. And always on the first day of school, and I experienced this twice myself being in his class, he would stand in front of each class. And at the first day of school, he would stand up there and say, I don't know if you believe in God, and if you don't, that's totally okay. I'm thrilled you're in my class, but I just want you to know that I believe that God wanted you in this class. And I want you to know that I love you. And he would say, I have a symbol of that. And he would put his hands together. He would go like this, and he would say, and this is my symbol of that. It's like this, and then like this. And he'd ask them to do that back to him. And everyone in the class would do that back to him. And all throughout the year, just, not every day, but every few weeks, he would do this. And of course, by the end of the school year, every student would be doing that back to him. And of course, he embodied it in countless other ways as well, staying after school to listen to a student who was going through a hard time, remembering something about a student. Hey, how was your father's surgery? Going to their birthday parties at their home, that he embodied that same presence, that nearness, that attentiveness, that patience, that love that was the most precious gift that we can give to one another. And when any of the followers of Christ do that in our own lives, we are indeed bringing the presence of Christ into the lives of those we're with. So what does this mean to us, for us practically? Well, it certainly does not diminish the significance of our words. Our words are indeed wonderful ways to convey love. And it doesn't diminish the significance of tangible physical things that we can provide, food or medicine or shelter, or bringing a meal to a neighbor when they're going through a hard time. These things can be a powerful embodiment of that love that we wish to convey. Jesus said that even a cup of water given in his name would merit an eternal reward. So those physical things are immensely consequential as well. But I would propose that nothing matters more than simply offering the presence of Christ, the presence of the attentiveness and the love and the patience and the kindness that Jesus himself embodied everywhere he went. And I know that that's CERI's purpose in all that they do, that they're not simply providing physical things, but they are seeking to strengthen and renew and rebuild families that can be hubs of love for children. And that they seek in their interactions with these children and with the families and with all they serve within each of the countries where they're working, they desire for their presence to be that kind of love as well. And of course, this is for each of us as well, even as we can financially support CERI's work and extend that love and presence through them, we can do the same things within our own home and family this Christmas, knowing that while there's certainly many wonderful things we can give to those around us, the most precious gift we can give is the gift of presence. And that is the very gift that each of us have received on Christmas through Jesus Christ, because Jesus is Emmanuel, God present with us. And his presence with us enables our presence with those we are with as well. That is my prayer for each of you as you spend time with family and friends over holidays, as you finish out the year at work, recognizing the preciousness of that gift that each of us have to give, and making that gift the first and primary gift that we give to each person we encounter. So I'll say a word of prayer, and then we can dig into some other things. Dear Lord, we thank you for your presence with us in this very moment, in each of the various places where we're watching from. We thank you that you are indeed with us. And thank you, too, for how you embodied that presence in Jesus Christ, Emmanuel, God with us. And so I do pray, Lord, I pray for CERI and each of the people that are serving in and through CERI all over the world, Lord, that they indeed would be your presence to children and to families in every corner of the places they're working, Lord. And may each of us do that in our own homes and work and family as well. We pray this in Jesus' name. Amen.
Amen. And Jedd, thank you so much for starting us off on that beautiful note. That idea of presence really resonates with me and leads us perfectly into what I believe many of the people on this call and listening in and will listen to the video afterwards are wondering how that presence then radiates out into this idea of mission now in a very interesting world. And so, Elli, I'd love to start with you and ask you a question. Thanks again for being here on the panel. From what we know, you guide and advise church members, organizations nationally on active mission here in the U.S. and around the world. And Faith to Action is this kind of passionate view of seeing church engage with the best way of helping orphans. Can you tell us more about how people can serve in that interesting world and how you've been working with organizations?
Yeah. Well, for those of you who are a part of a church who's really working hard to figure out how we can do our best for vulnerable children in our cities and around the world, I just applaud you. I love what I get to do every day, which is support the work of the church. So Faith to Action is actually not an organization that does anything. I kind of joke, but what we get to do is support the efforts of Christians and churches around the world who are trying to respond to children in their communities who need help, but doing that in a way that is informed by best practices. So we're a coalition of Christian organizations that have come together to elevate those best practices. For many of those who want to do good for vulnerable children, we don't always have access to the academic or kind of the international level of research and guidance. And so Faith to Action exists to be a bridge between what we're learning is working well for children and Christians who want to serve children. So we provide free resources that provide, that research, but also guidance, share stories and case studies of what's working well around the world, provide coaching and relational support as we do this work together. So what does that actually look like for a lot of us? Those of you who are joining from the United States or from countries who often are kind of the donor role in this work, it's about being an educated donor. taking the time to learn and to understand the complexity of the issues when it comes to orphans and vulnerable children, specifically recognizing what we've learned over decades of research, that the importance of strengthening families, of supporting family-based alternatives to kids who cannot be in their own biological families, and addressing those root causes to the vulnerability of children. And so that's what we do. We try to ensure that donors feel educated in the decisions that they're going to make. And we also want to encourage the church to share and spread the word about what they're learning is working well for kids and the needs of children around the world. So really growing a movement of advocates who are sharing the challenges that families are facing, but also some of the innovative solutions. And that's why it's so exciting to be doing this work, because there is stuff that is working for kids and families in ways that are having great outcomes for children. We also can come alongside people who are figuring out in their organizations what it means to transition the way that they're working to better practices. So it's just a gift to be doing this work alongside many of my partners on this panel today.
Elli, thank you so much. And we'll come back to a full discussion after this as well. I'm grateful to hear about all those ideas of how to be present and how to be informed and have that be a culmination of a way to serve. So Damaris, I'd love to come over to you. We know that you are with City Church and that you've actually been working with an organization called Casa Hogar in Mexico, and about some transformational work that your congregation has done to help kids grow in families. Over these past couple of years, as travel's been limited, things have been kind of different. How have you all been able to serve, and you as a social action pastor been able to lead people in a way to serve and be present?
Yeah, thank you, Ian. So like you said, we have a partner in Chihuahua, Mexico called Casa Hogar Pies Hermosos. And our last team came back on March 4th, 2020. I was in the hospital having my last child, and our team was coming back from Chihuahua, and that was the last time we were able to go. And so we had just restarted travel. And so, once the pandemic hit, we knew, hey, this is something that we needed not only for ourselves, but for the children that are at Casa Hogar, for their protection. And just with the travel bans, we knew that, we had to pause. But what we've learned in this season, and I may talk about this a little more, but there has been a huge transition. So Casa Hogar was serving as an orphanage. And now they're in these last 2 years, they've transitioned to a transitional shelter. And so we've actually been able to walk with them in this time. And the thing is, we're not experts in child and orphan care and things of that sort. But what we can do is continue to build relationship. And so that's what we were able to do within these last 2 years. Our people want to help children. They want to have that interaction. But the best thing we can do is provide care for the caregivers. And so building that relationships with the directors there and being a continuous support, I think is probably the best gift we can give, even better than going there or the tangible things that we do or the financial gifts that we give, is caring for the people that are with these children and are trying to strengthen these families. And I know, like, even in ministry, it's talked a lot about, it's lonely sometimes, right? And so I think even for people in different countries and people that are doing their own ministry when it comes to orphan care, it could be lonely. And so it is important for us to be that friend, be that pastor. I know our lead pastor, Pastor Brent, the directors there at Casa Hogar see him as their pastor. And so again, it's just caring for the caregivers. And I think in this digital age, what better way to be able to do that with some of our partners overseas?
Thank you, Damaris. And I love that further look at, how you can be present and how relationships matter. And there's so many different ways to be active in relationships. And also, thanks for starting out that things changed drastically in 2020, and we all had to reinvent and think about things differently. So, Dr. Hillis, I'd love to come over to you. You've been working intensively in bringing some less visible impacts of COVID-19 to the forefront that are happening to children, and proposing solutions to governments, families, communities, and just ways that people can act. So could you share a little bit just to set the scene so we can kind of get a sense in our hearts and drive what we know about the toll on children, the magnitude, and what remains hidden?
Yeah, I would love to, but I'd love to share with you a little bit about how it all started. It was really, I think, Jedd, your with idea that started it, and then I'll be glad to share for a few minutes. So about 12 months ago, I got a crackling Zoom call from a good friend in Zambia, Remy, and we started talking. He goes, "Oh, Susan, I've been worried so much. If COVID comes to our country the way it has come to yours and takes out the grannies, what are we going to do? There will really be no one left to take care of the orphans." And I began my background is that I'm an epidemiologist, and I began to lay in bed at night and think about the fact that I could see in my mind how we could figure out how many children were affected by orphanhood. And what we know is that globally at this point, we know whenever you have a surge in COVID cases, you're going to have a surge in COVID deaths within a couple of weeks until we have strong herd immunity in a country. And what we are not seeing, what has been hidden, is whenever you have a surge in deaths, you will at the same time have a surge in orphanhood. This report I'm showing is available for free. Anyone can download it. And the orphanhood numbers for every country in the world are in a table in the appendix. So you're free to look at it. And they are updated every month on an interactive calculator out of Imperial College. But I wanted to make sure you all had something, anyone interested who could to look at what's happening in their own country. The data are available, they're free, and they're online, and they're here. And so the curves that you see on the right, these are just the first year or so, roughly 14 months of the pandemic. But you see the purple are the COVID deaths, and the blue are the numbers of children who either had their mother or father or their grandparent who live with them and help provide for their needs and nurture die during because of COVID associated causes. The reason you see these little black lines here is in 2020, the first 10 months, if you looked over to the right, there were 1.8 million COVID deaths and 0.9 million children that ended up affected by orphanhood or death of their caregivers. And if you look in 2021, the next 5 months, so half the time, we basically doubled the numbers of deaths and doubled the number of children. So it was really heartbreaking. Next slide, please. So I'm just showing here the map that's color-coded for where the impacts are greatest or were greatest the first year. This has actually changed. India is dramatically purple, more purple than anywhere else now. And it's not that the orphanhood has increased so much. It's that we finally have some much more reliable estimates of COVID deaths that we could use for modeling our findings. But mostly what we wanted to show is every region of the world is affected. And the dark purple countries are countries with between 100 and 200,000 children newly having lost their mothers and fathers during just the first year of the pandemic. Next slide, please. And so I want to emphasize something, and that is every one of these pieces of data that I'm showing you, it is composed of faces. So this is a little girl whose mother and father had died before COVID and was being raised by her grandmama. And I'm using this photo with permission. The little girl's grandma got COVID about 4 weeks ago, day 9, drops dead at home, and boiling water was on the stove, and the little girl toddles over and tries to pour it on top of herself and it just scalds her head and her shoulders. She screams, and the pastor who lives nearby and his wife here, I mean, talking about presence, Jedd, and even the church, Elli, they run in, they grab the little girl, take her to the hospital, and she begins to recover. Then they figure out who is left in the family and where that person is, and find a great aunt who can take care of the little girl. So she's recovering now and with the great aunt. But what I want to emphasize is the reason I wanted to show you these data is because my prayer is they would drive us to prayer. Because one of the best ways to be present, which Damaris, I'm sure you did when you were from a distance, is by praying with people, as many of you did for even this session before we joined. And what I want to show you on the curves on the right are that in early July, we began to see the third wave of COVID in a lot of the African countries that was much worse than the earlier waves. And this, what I opened with by saying, every surge in COVID deaths will be accompanied by a surge in COVID orphanhood. That's what we see. I mean, look at Kenya, Zimbabwe, Zambia, Uganda. But inside of those curves, they are full of children like this little girl. And I just think it's a call to the church around the world to see them, because nobody else is seeing them, but pastors are doing the funerals or visiting the sick, and to help the church see them and come alongside of them. Next slide, please. And so I'm just summarizing that we have another paper that just went up on the Lancet preprint server about a week ago. You could find it by just Googling my name, Hillis, 5.2 million children, Lancet, and it would come up. But we have newly available data, and now the total of children as of the end of October that had lost a parent or caregiver is 5.2 million children, which is more than the number of deaths from COVID that day. But by that date, still that's just minimum estimates. So that means that now the past 6 months, one child is losing their mother or father or their grandparent caregiver every 6 seconds. And we know that addressing the loss the children have experienced will be advanced by these 3 Ps: preventing death by advancing vaccination and public health prevention of COVID, preparing families for alternative care and kinship care. Like when someone's sick, we should begin talking about, like, okay, if someone does not recover, who are the children and who can help with them? And then protecting children from their increased risks of violence, abuse, neglect, and exploitation. And I can say that I'm very encouraged, because as the data is going out, there's been more and more attention from the church and from governments. And there are even governments like Colombia and Brazil that are beginning to draft legislation. Next slide, please. And then that's the end. So I'll just close by giving an example of what the church has been doing. I also serve on the leadership of World Without Orphans, and just the leaders, the national leaders all over the world were so impressive. And I know some of the CERI leads from Sri Lanka and Uganda and India, for example, were involved in this, that within 3 months, about half of the 80 languages needing translation were translated just on a volunteer basis from a lot of the World Without Orphans faith leads around the world. And those parenting tips that really help get evidence-based approaches to protecting children into families were distributed, and about 20 million families were engaged in them. And India was one of the places where there were a really large number: Kyrgyzstan, Zambia, Paraguay, a number of countries. And that's all. But you can close down the slides, and I'll close with a verse. And that is from Luke 10, verse 1. We read Jesus saying, he sent them 2 by 2 to the places he himself was about to go. But when he sends them, he doesn't really tell them go. He says, therefore pray to the Lord of harvest, to the Lord of the harvest, that he would send forth laborers into the harvest, which are people to be with us, people to be with them. So you may think, like, Susan Hillis, why are you sharing all this data for us? So we're talking about the church, because if we don't know what the needs are, we can't pray. And if we can't pray into the needs, it's much more likely that the needs will be met. So thank you so much for the opportunity to share with you all.
Thank you, Dr. Hillis. What a heartbreaking and heartening view of things. And it's so, it's just very moving. Thank you for sharing that. Elli, thanks for starting us off. And Damaris and Jedd, I'd like to ask you a quick question here. And before I do that, I'd just like to encourage anybody that is attending, please use that question and answer, that Q&A button at the bottom. Have any questions, share with everyone. We're going to have a little bit of time to kind of have a greater discussion. So, Jedd, we know that one of CAFO's core principles is written, actually, good intentions alone are insufficient. All care for children must be guided by both knowledge and wisdom, which is based on Proverbs 19 and Philippians 1. I'm wondering, could you share a little bit about how this principle unfolds in kind of a mission now kind of thinking as people are trying to figure out how to serve, how to be present, take us all this information they've heard? How can they take that principle of being guided with knowledge and wisdom and apply it?
Thanks, Ian. That's a great question. And I would, one way we could describe what flows out of that view would be the idea of living with a humility, but not paralysis. Like humility, but not paralysis. Humility on the side of recognizing, wow, we all are very frail. Our view is limited. Our understanding's incomplete when we're entering a situation. Even one we know very well, let alone that we're relatively new to, we have this understanding of our own finiteness and not just the possibility that we're mistaken, but the high likelihood that there are certain things we're doing that need to be improved, and that is almost certain. And so whatever we're taking on, we're going in with a sense of, okay, I need to hold these things lightly. I may have a clear mission, but I may need to continually change the tactics I use or the way I do this. I need to perhaps most of all begin with listening and attentiveness, rather than just charging in, say, okay, I'm going to have that listening stance. And that is where service, I believe it's where all service begins is with that listening stance. All love begins with listening well. And so that all of that comes with that stance of humility and a desire to draw upon the best available science, where we're looking at, hey, what does the research show us? What does scripture tell us about these situations? What do those who have lived in this reality, what do they have to say about these things? So starting with that humility, but I would note that there's a counterweighting truth that we need to hold as well. And that is not being paralyzed by the fact that we know that we're fallible and we're probably going to make mistakes along the way. And that reminds me of the parable, that Jesus told about the talents, and where the master entrusted talents to three different stewards, and two of them invested them. And when the master returned, they said to the master, "Hey, you gave me 5 talents, you gave me 2 talents. Here's 2 more, right?" But there was the one guy who, out of fear, took what he had been given and he buried it. And when the master returned, he said, "Hey, look, I've still got this 1 talent you gave me. Aren't I great?" And of course, those who know the story know that the master was very unhappy about that. And it wasn't because that servant had risked the money and lost it. It was because he had buried it. He hadn't tried to use it well. I suspect that if the guy had invested it and lost it, the master would have probably said, "Hey, you can do better next time, but here's another, give it another try." But in this situation, he had been paralyzed out of fear. And I think there is a danger, particularly when we're aware of all the ways we can make mistakes. And so, that blend of coming in with humility, but a willingness to risk, willingness to make mistakes along the way, is pairing those two things, holding them both together. I think that's what it looks like as we wade out into the complexity of our world.
Thank you very much. And it'd be interesting now as people wade out into that complexity of the world, how we're able to take the learnings from the past 1.5, 2 years and truly radiate out that presence. I am getting some wonderful questions from our team, and I'm just going to put them out to anyone to respond. We'll take about the next 15 minutes to just kind of have an open panel discussion and ask Connie to close after that. So the first question might be a tricky one, but here we go. When is it safe to go on a mission trip?
I'm happy to talk a little bit about that since I work at the CDC and we're making these kind of recommendations a lot. And I'm happy for other people to also chime in. So I would say in this day and age, you certainly want to be sure that you're vaccinated before you go. And then you also, in a lot of countries, it's a lot harder to get in if you're not vaccinated. And then the second thing is you would be wise to know the COVID situation in the country that you're going to. Like if it is extremely dangerous, if everything's locked down, and the likelihood that you would actually be able to do what you're hoping to do. Some countries, on and off will have mandatory 10 to 14 day quarantines after arrival. And the situation is so fluid and unpredictable. I mean, I myself am starting to travel some, but it is, I'm having to learn all the requirements beforehand, and they're always changing, and it's not smooth. And so just expect for your test not to work out right or to have delays. It's, go with flexibility. And I think if you feel like the Lord is leading you to go with confidence.
Maybe just to respond in a different direction, there was big fear that in the nonprofit world, we'd see a dip of funding because people weren't going to be visiting anymore. And the evidence has been mixed on that. Some research we just did suggested that people aren't stopping funding, but what's not happening is people, because they're not traveling, because they're not thinking about traveling, because our media isn't covering it, we're not responding at the level of the crisis. So the reality is that normally when there's a crisis, the U.S. Christian community rises up and provides aid and charity, and they play a huge role in supporting responses to natural disasters and to war and to hunger around the world. That we have not seen that with COVID. And, most of us have been consumed by the impact it has had on our own families, on our own communities, and that makes so much sense. But it's important that we do open our eyes right now to the way that COVID is impacting families around the world, and that we act, because we're not out there seeing it. We're not acting. So maybe people aren't, dropping their sponsored child, but they're also not fundraising to the needs that we see around the world. And in addition to what Susan said, a colleague at USAID many months ago was talking about this is a slow onset global disaster of extreme proportions, but it hasn't been seen. We don't have the images of buildings that have crashed like you would in an earthquake or otherwise. But in addition to the loss of caregivers, as Susan has described, 140 million children in developing countries falling into poverty. And that number has been going down until now. Huge increase of extreme poverty, loss of jobs. The World Vision recently had a study talking about how the increase in food insecurity for families, mental health problems in children, increased child labor, school dropout, physical violence that children are experiencing, early marriage, youth pregnancy. So this is a disaster, and we need to be responding. I think the fact that we haven't been able to go has really limited the response. And, the reality is, I think people just don't know. I was just talking to the head of a missions department at a large Christian denomination, and asking him, what has been the progress that you guys have been working on to improve your church's way of engaging orphaned and vulnerable children? And he said, sorry, there's just been too much stuff to do. And I get that. Believe me, racial justice, political divides, COVID, there is so much to do. But then I shared a little bit about what Susan had shared and some of what we're learning regarding the impact on kids. And, he just didn't know. And when he did, it was shocking. And I think that we have to share what's going on with children and families around the world, because we have to see the church response, whether or not they can visit. They need to know what's happening.
And to give a perspective on, I know we are looking at what next year looks like for us in traveling. And so we're kind of in the thick of it, right? And I think there is having the wisdom, knowing what recommendations there are, but remember, like, we go because we love people. And so how can we love in the best way? And so I know we're going to be looking at ways we can do that with, preventative measures and how are they doing, right? Because it's not just about protecting us. I mean, these children are vulnerable already. They don't have the same medical care we have. They don't have the same access to healthcare as we have. And so we really have to go in if we want to love them in tangibly in person. One of the best things we can do is to ensure that they're healthy. And so that is something that we're looking at people are passionate to go, but we're also going to put some procedures, some safety protocols in place when we go.
And I have to say, there is so much we can do other than going, right? One of the creative things that I love, especially bigger churches are getting this, but I think all churches need to think about what role could we play in educating and advocating for issues amongst our colleagues and peers, other Christians in our spaces. It's not all about what we do, but can we actually bring people around the issues that are impacting children and advocate for best practices for those children, and seeing some really creative ways that churches are engaging not only their congregations, but other congregations to educate them on what's happening and also to move them towards better practices.
Well, and Elli, I appreciate that I don't even have to facilitate anymore. This is fantastic. So that was my next question. I'd love to put this out to everybody. What are some non-traditional ways to engage in mission? What have you seen? What have you been praying through? What have your organizations been proponing?
So I think for us, and it goes similar to you, what you're saying, Elli, but is sharing the stories. And so to engage in mission, like, people need to know what's going on. And so we always craft a way to share what our partners are doing, but we've been more intentional because here's the thing, the work has not stopped. Like, if anything, the work has gotten greater. And so we craft time within our services or our platforms to share the work that our partners are doing and to keep in the forefront of, hey, this pandemic is not just here. Like, COVID-19 didn't just affect your home or city. It's already affected partners and who are already in vulnerable situations. And so it's about sharing the stories and sharing the success and how they're continuing to do wonderful things for children as we are here in our own. And so I think it works both engaging in missions and sharing their story, but it also enlightens our people and inspires our people to know that the same God that is working there is working here too.
I just wanted to mention, I sense, especially, I think at least half of the people on are from the U.S. We really have a serious COVID orphanhood problem in the U.S. About 200,000 children as of today have had a parent or a primary caregiver die due to COVID-associated causes. And it is particularly extreme among the minority populations. And so there's just, there's a front page New York Times article on the virtual New York Times version today, and there'll be a print version tomorrow and a full report. And it will be speaking to the hidden pain among bereaved children in the United States. So part of what I think I'm seeing is, I feel like the Lord is calling me to have like a here and there. Or I think, Jedd, you say it so well, learn globally and act locally, or you say it better than that, but just this idea of it's the local location where we can really make the most difference. And as I've just been praying, Lord, bring COVID or children who have been, faced the death of a parent or caregiver to me. I actually have had one walk up into my yard about a month ago and meet me. And, I had never met her before. She just happened to walk by, and I'm just struck at how it's not only going that we need to do, it's having eyes to see the opportunities as we're staying.
And I think for the global piece too, Susan, that's empowering those local churches in the communities in India and Brazil, in those places that we're seeing so much death, to be able to be that person, be in those spaces. And, I think there is, when it comes to global or cross-cultural partnerships, opportunity for maturity of partnership. Because I've heard that from people. We did a study of, we sat down for an hour and a half and talked to donors about how COVID has changed their partnership with these global orphan care organizations. And, they've honestly said things like, I had to let go of control. I usually go every quarter. And now but wow, they're stepping up. The dynamics that happen in partnership, the power dynamics are really interesting. And this could be a time for us to really balance those out, and recognize the importance of empowering the local church to be the present and knowing it's not us. You can't do anything in 2 weeks for a vulnerable family. I mean, you can do something, but what's the real impact are those churches on the ground, and those leaders and the volunteers and the grandmas who can really be empowered to be there for the long term, just like Susan was for her neighbor who walked in, or whoever it was who walked on your front door.
Mm. Yeah, I just want to say hearty amen to what my three friends here said. I think that of course, there are some wonderful innovations that have happened over this time. I know a lot of organizations, for instance, are leading virtual mission trips, which is, an interesting innovation that I think could stand the test of time, even beyond the travel limitations. And there's and other things like that. But I think, of course, more importantly, more fundamentally, is in some ways the question: how do we enable presence for those who need it most in all the parts of the world? And when obviously we can't do that, we're more aware than ever of our limitations right now in that we work through organizations, and particularly the local church in many different parts of the world, to be that presence in the lives of children and lives of families in these other places. And we can do that financially. What a wonderful thing that we can extend presence through finances, through wonderful organizations like we're being hosted here by one of them, right? And then at the same time, as Susan was reminding, that same need for presence is right across the street as well. And of course, that's in formal ways in the U.S. foster system. There's some tremendous needs there. And whether that's, we're willing to be a foster parent or a mentor or a CASA, be working with families that have fallen apart during COVID, helping them reunite and supporting them in that journey, or informally. Of course, there's a lot of, as Susan was alluding to, a lot of families that lost a parent or another caregiver, and they're not necessarily in the foster system, but they are, limping through a really painful time. And to be that presence in those families and homes, even as we're sending financial resources to the other side of the world so people can do that same thing there, we can do those two things at the same time.
Yeah, thank you all so much. We have just one more minute, and then I'll hand it over to Connie. Jedd, I'm so grateful that you brought us right full circle back to that idea of presence and how it just kind of radiates out. Does anyone have any other last comments on how they see people being able to do missions as we move forward in this world?
I think we have to have this conversation. I'm sorry that I have to be the one to say, but, there's some things we've learned that we should not do. And you hear numbers like what Susan shared, and it's overwhelming. And my heart breaks every time, and I'm sure many people here listening has too. But I just want to recognize a lesson that we learned in the last 30 years. And by we, I mean, the global space of knowledge and evidence. Now's not the time to build new orphanages or grow residential care style responses to orphans. We learned this when we saw the response to the HIV and AIDS epidemic, especially in sub-Saharan Africa. There was this proliferation of orphanages as the model to respond to the need, really well-intentioned intention, desire to care. And we saw a huge amount of orphanages being built and funded and filled and all of that. But what we realized is they were being massively overused. Children, even to this day, are in orphanages that could be in their families or could be in other families. And so there's this misuse of orphanages really as a response. That is not what these kids need. Most of these kids have other parents, other grandparents, other aunties, uncles. If not, there are family options that, within the community where a child can stay in their own context, in their own community, in a family. And so I just want to put that warning out there and recognize that there are incredible solutions that we've been talking about, but the solution that is not going to work is to build more orphanages.
Can I just close with one short little story about that? So there's a county in Kenya, Narok County, which has the highest teen pregnancy rate in the country. And there were some really urgent problems there when young girls would come to basically issue legal complaints. There was no place for a young girl who had been raped to stay other than in a jail cell. So I met with a magistrate in my trip there for PEPFAR about 2 years ago, and she said to me, what we need is a shelter. And I said, no, what you need is not a shelter. You need the Christians in the community to be trained to provide emergency foster care and certified by the government. And you need the trusted pastors to step up and advise you who they could be. And I just left broken. And I kept seeing that jail cell and imagining those poor girls inside of it, waiting for the magistrate to have time to talk with them, and prayed about it. And of course, heard nothing. And then here, 2 years later, 2 weeks ago, I'm having a conversation with the World Without Orphans lead from Kenya. And she says to me, Susan, guess what? The government has asked us to do training in emergency foster care. And she goes, guess where the first county is we're going to start? And I said, she didn't even know my story. I said, oh, let me tell you the story. I hope the first county is Narok County. She said, it is. It's the first county we're going to start is Narok County. So I feel like part of what God is doing is he is catalyzing those national leaders and calling them, and they are hearing him. And that's part of what we need to pray in. So thank you so much for saying it, Elli. It is so true. And we have this hope as an anchor for our souls that God is doing it more and more.
Thank you, everyone. And Dr. Hillis, it just reminds me of that picture you showed of that girl, and the story about that young girl being cared for wasn't that she was sent to an orphanage. It was that her family was found, the pastors reacted, the family was activated and supported. And that's, I think, what flows through that idea of being present and listening and focusing on relationships and some of the things we can control if we can't physically be in a place. So I am so grateful to everyone. And Connie, I would be really grateful for you to close us up.
Thank you, Ian. And all I can say is, wow, what an evening. Thank you so much, panelists. You have been so inspiring for me. I'm used to going and being out there in the field at least 3-4 times a year. I haven't gone in now exactly 2 years. And, that can curb the inspiration or the enthusiasm a little bit, that affects something inside of me and inside of a lot of people who have been calling and texting and asking, when can we go? And although the data that you presented is tragic, is 5.2 million children facing orphanhood as a result of COVID. That's horrible. But Jedd, thank you for the encouragement and the reminder not to be paralyzed, to do something, to act and with humility, but to do something about it. And it looks like there's a lot we can do, regardless of where we are, regardless of our financial means. There's a lot we can do. We can bring people together. We can build relationships. We can advocate for services, for resources. We can spread the word. We can empower local partners. We can strengthen families. We can provide access to services and to avenues for communication to people, to partners, to governments, to nations, to churches. There's so much we can do. And I'm grateful for this evening. I'm grateful for each one of you. Thank you, Jedd, Susan, Elli, Damaris. Thank you for being here, for putting aside some part of your evening to be here. I hope and trust that many people will listen to your words, to the wisdom that has been shared, and will be empowered to do something. It's a truly honest conversation that has to happen in the Christian world, especially Elli, as you said, and that's one of our questions out there. What should we avoid doing in the context of the pandemic? Thank you for, just moving forward and addressing it, because we ran out of time. So we want to be very respectful of everybody's time. But yeah, thank you, panelists. Thank you, our technical support team, Ian, Eileen, Angela, everybody, for making this event happen. And to all of you who participated right now online and asked questions, our wonderful audience, and those of you who will participate by listening and tuning in at a later time, if you want to be part of the ongoing conversation regarding how to help orphans, subscribe to our newsletter, stay engaged, follow organizations such as CAFO, such as Faith to Action on social media. These are trusted partners, trusted Christian organizations that can guide you in the right direction. Thank you, everyone, for your participation, for your contribution. I am glad to see familiar faces. I'm glad to meet new people. Thank you, and have a very blessed evening.